Welcome back, everyone. We'll start the last segment of our programming for Friday, or for today. The next panel, the Paradigm Shift panel, will be moderated by Ivan Rosenberg. Ivan is a master strategist and a frequent and popular public speaker. He's the president and CEO of Frontier Associates, and he also has a bachelor's and master's degree in electrical engineering, computer science from Cornell, and a master's and PhD in management from University of Rochester. Please welcome Ivan Rosenberg.
So we're all pretty supportive of the purposes of the Space Frontier Foundation to have general access to space by the public and have space off-Earth colonization. However, as we said yesterday, we're still a movement. To be business as usual, the public is going to have to alter its view of access to space and their skepticism about it and their belief that it's rare and expensive and the subject of science fiction to space as a commodity, much like we treat cell phones today. And we also heard earlier the need, if we're really going to accomplish low-cost access to space, that we're going to have to shift from maybe how we do things to something called agile aerospace, where instead of focusing all our attention on zeroing out the risk with all the time and expense that takes, to maybe an approach that says, build it, fly it, fail, fix it, and try it again, and do that very quickly over and over and over again. That's a paradigm shift. So there's at least two paradigm shifts, one on the public and one of how we do things, that are going to be necessary for us to accomplish the goals that this conference and Space Frontier Foundation is all about. It's probably true that if we just keep doing things as we're doing them, those shifts will probably eventually occur. But the question is there something we can do to accelerate the paradigm shift, the process, and thereby accomplish our goals even earlier? By the way, to get the size of an obstacle, a paradigm is a belief that somebody considers the obvious truth. So we all got them. If all you have to do is look at your beliefs about politics, about space, about religion, about anything, those beliefs that you consider, well, that's obvious. Well, that's a paradigm. And the big thing to get about a paradigm is information is not sufficient to cause a paradigm shift. If that were true, there'd be no bigots in the world. So it's something else is needed to have people shift from what they consider the obvious truth to something else. So what we thought we would do is, rather than go to people within the industry and ask them, we thought we'd go outside the industry. Just like NewSpace in some way is outside the industry and coming up with new ideas that will help the industry move quickly, we thought we would go outside to areas in which a paradigm shift has occurred already or is occurring, and see if there were lessons learned there that we could use for the NewSpace movement. So specifically, we're going to look at computers and how that shifted from a government monopoly to the kind of ubiquitous computers on everybody's, in fact, in everybody's pocket practically with cell phones. We're going to look at CubeSats, which while space, it nevertheless was a radically different way of looking at spacecraft and how that's sort of in early stages, but maybe has some level of adoption, but still has some ways to go. Commercial use of UAVs, which is very much in its infancy, and the paradigms there are still being argued out. And then we have an expert from a company that most of you know called IDEO. And one simple way of describing IDEO is its job is to come up with disruptive ideas that make a huge difference. And we're going to hear from an expert in that area. So we have some 4 really great panelists. The intention of this is, we don't know the answers, and the intention is in the discussion that takes place up here, in the kinds of questions that you bring up and the suggestions you have, that we end up with some ideas, maybe new ideas, and some actions that the Space Frontier Foundation and all of us can take to help accelerate this paradigm shift. So let me quickly introduce our panelists. John Hollar is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Computer History Museum, the world's leading institution exploring the history of computing and its ongoing impact on society. John was previously President of the Television and Broadcast Education Division of Pearson plc in London, and before that he has served as Executive Vice President of the Public Broadcasting Service, where he launched the award-winning PBS.org. Dave Blakely leads the technology strategy practice at IDEO, which explores the business opportunities created when emerging technologies are linked with customer needs. As a senior director based in Palo Alto, Dave manages various strategic business relationships and advises executives of technology-focused companies. Much of his advisory work involves helping IDEO clients, from Silicon Valley executives to NASA officials, build cultures of innovation and develop products and services to maintain market leadership. Larry Osborne. Larry is Executive Vice President and Chief Strategy Officer and a member of the Board of Directors of DreamHammer, a Santa Monica-based software company that provides intelligent software control products for commercial, defense, and intelligent customers. Its first product, Ballista, is an OS for drones and allows one person to simultaneously control multiple drones of any type. You want to get an idea, if you think about the early days of computers, when you could run one program at a time. And then all of a sudden, CPM and Windows came along, and all of a sudden you could do multiple things simultaneously. So I sort of look at Ballista as the Windows for UAVs. While serving as a U.S. naval aviator, Larry accumulated more than 4,000 hours of flight time and 850 carrier landings and tactical jet aircraft. Commanded the deployed Operational Light Attack Squadron, served as an officer on an aircraft carrier, and provided technical and policy advice to the Secretary of Defense, the Chief of Naval Operations, and the Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Pacific Command. In 1994, Larry completed his military career with the rank of Captain, U.S. Navy. Following nearly 8 years with Northrop Grumman as the corporate lead executive in Hawaii, tough duty, Larry joined DreamHammer as the company's chief operating officer. And finally, Jordy, I always muck up your name. How he said it. Dr. Jordy is currently a professor at the Aerospace Engineering Department at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. In 1999, Jordy and Professor Bob Twiggs at Stanford developed the CubeSat standard. His team at Cal Poly was responsible for the development of the standard CubeSat deployer, the Peapod, and has supported launches for over 100 CubeSats in the US and abroad. In 2011, Jordy co-founded TIVAC, Nano Satellite Systems, to support the commercial CubeSat market, and is currently the company's CEO. Customers include universities, NASA, ESA, NSF, DoD, Boeing, and the Aerospace Corporation. In addition to launch activities, Jordy's team has been involved in the development and launch of 6 CubeSats and is currently working on 3 additional CubeSats. So you go to get who's in front of us. This is quite a prestigious panel. So I'm going to start off with you, John. And so the question is, computers have obviously followed a path that's pretty similar to space in some ways. That is, it started off as pretty much a government monopoly, one or two of a kind, and so it's clearly in a different role today. So the question is, what has the development of computers in history, what can we learn for that relative to our development of space?
Great, thank you, Ivan, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal view of the way innovation has happened in computing over the last 70 years or so, and state a very simple thesis, and then give you 7 examples of how I think the shifts have happened in computing, with one health warning, which is a member of my board who is a very noted historian named Richard Tedlow. And Tedlow stopped a board meeting at the Computer History Museum about 3 years ago when he said, you guys are all engineers, and my board is largely engineers, smart engineers. And he said, you're looking for an algorithm that will tell you history. And I'm here to tell you there is no algorithm for history. There is only competing views of history, and you put the ideas out there and let them compete. So with that caveat that this may not necessarily agree with your view of history, I'm going to talk about these major shifts. And this thesis is that shifts have come in the computing field largely through the consolidation of gradual waves of innovation that have then been consolidated into a great leap forward, largely at the hands of a visionary leader. And let me talk about some specific examples. I'll start with 1946-48, when William Shockley and his team at Bell Labs invented the transistor, for which they later won the Nobel Prize. The transistor represented, among many things, the consolidation of what was known about gate technology and vacuum tube computing, and the acceleration of that through the invention of the transistor. Then about 10 years later, in 1957-58, right here in Silicon Valley, Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore and John Herney and the team at Fairchild consolidated everything that was known about transistor technology into the invention of the integrated circuit, where multiple transistors could be located on a single circuit, which was another great leap forward. 15 years later, after that group had left Fairchild to form Intel in 1973-74, a team working under Gordon Moore and Bob Noyce, namely Ted Hoff and Federico Fagin, consolidated everything that was known about integrated circuit technology into the invention of the first microprocessor, which, again, changed everything. 10 years later, in 1984, Steve Jobs consolidated everything that was known about the technology of personal computing, processing, new types of software, new type of interface, and invented the Macintosh. That was 1984. 1994, Tim Berners-Lee takes everything that was known about distributed computing, the TCP/IP layer on the internet, the ability to build graphic interfaces and software that would work over the internet, and writes the first paper for something called the World Wide Web. In 2004, 10 years after that, Mark Zuckerberg takes everything that was known not only about the internet and graphical interfaces, but the building of community and the demand for usage of the internet among all of us, and releases Facebook. So here we are at 2014, 10 years after 2004. And thanks to all of you guys, given that 10-year cycle of change, I just can't wait to get in my car later this year and go directly into space and orbit a bit and then land again, because if we were on that same continuum of 10 years of enormous progress consolidated by one visionary leader, that might be something we would start approximating. Now, I'm oversimplifying at a huge level, and of course you can think of other moments in computing from 1946 to 2014 that were equally stunning. But again and again in the field of computing, you see this consolidation, waves of improvement, a moment in history when a great leap forward becomes possible, and a visionary leader who consolidates all of that, has a new idea, and then manufactures a great leap forward. I don't know the parallels in that model to space exploration. You would know that far better than I. But it is, again and again, part of what has brought us to the point where we are, where we expect a small miracle, if we're holding them in our hands or we're using them in the cloud, to occur almost every year now. I want to talk about a couple of other things that I think can be extracted from the history of computing. If you're thinking about paradigm shifts, sometimes it's good to think about what would happen if the opposite were true. So there's one thing that is true in computing that I think may be the opposite of what's true for you in your reality, and that is that the risk-reward ratio in computing is completely out of whack to any other industry, I think, of any kind at any time. And that's particularly true today. And Mark Andreessen is fond of saying, if you're working in software today, you can sit down at your desk, you can buy an operating system and storage and processing in the cloud from Amazon. You can set up a payment system through PayPal. You can market to 1 billion people by creating a Facebook page, and you can do all of that before lunch. So the whole risk-reward ratio in computing and innovation now is completely upside down to what it was in computing before and what it is in most industries. Again, I'm not quite sure what the parallels are, But that upside downness of computing, I think, has unleashed this enormous period of creativity. The third thing that is very different in computing is that the tool itself improves the technology. There's almost nothing else that you can think of where the tool itself gets better and better simply by the use of the tool. And in computing, of course, that's true. All of the gains that are happening now in computing and even the departure from current computing architecture has happened because computing itself is reinventing itself at the hands of really, really smart people. And the final thing I would say is that, oh, and by the way, 1/3 of the planet is still not connected on the internet. So imagine when 2 billion more brains come online sometime in the next decade, and all that creativity gets unleashed, and there could be yet another wave coming that we really can't even foresee. The final thing I would say is that computing has done a brilliant job of setting all of our expectations incredibly high. We all expect miracles to happen. We expect them to happen tomorrow or next week or next year, and sure enough, somebody turns up and presents us with a miracle. And I think there was a time, I grew up certainly as an absolute rabid space fan. The astronauts were my heroes. And there was a time when space was also setting those expectations for us continuously, almost like computing was. And I think that can happen again. I don't think we as the public are going to change our minds voluntarily. I think something exciting and compelling about the space program is going to have to be presented to us every day, every week, just as it is in computing, to recapture our imagination and rebuild a passion around space, just the way it has about the miracle of technology change. So those are the points I wanted to make just to start out the panel.
Great, thanks. So I hear two things, at least at the beginning, that might be useful. One is looking to consolidate. You know, how can I take this over here and put them together and cause the breakthrough that way?
That's right.
And the other one I hear is leadership, which, you know, we got a lot of engineers, and I also heard that yesterday, or I think it was mostly yesterday, pointing at the need that this is not just an engineering exercise, but that you need to be able to present, you need to make a business case, and so on. And the last thing I heard, which I think is particularly informative, that in the early days of space, everybody knew it was risky, big chances of failure. And quite frankly, I think that one of the mistakes, particularly I think NASA makes, is communicating this is business as usual. I think if you think about the Curiosity landing, you know, that the 7 minutes of terror went viral because it really did say, you know what, this might not happen. It's really risky. You know, there's 10,000 things, all of which have to go right, and that's ridiculous that that should happen. And people got, wow, this is really cool. I mean, you think about reading a book that has no suspense. And that's sort of how we communicate, and I think it's important to enroll the public in this is risky, it isn't clear, and there's lots of unknowns, and it needs to be a suspense novel, which is a little bit what enrolled us all in the first place.
That's
we
right.
know how risky it is. We got to let them know. All right, thank you. So IDEO is in the business of coming up with innovative ideas that I've seen some of them, and they look crazy and have not much to do with the past. So somehow you get people to use them and adopt them and make it business as usual. So what have we got to learn from that we can use in the space program?
Sure, thank you, Ivan. Let's talk a little bit about some of the paradigm shifts that I've observed, that I've had the privilege of observing in many, many years, multiple decades at IDEO. I sure appreciated Ivan's definition of paradigm, and I think we owe it to ourselves to put a tighter definition on the term paradigm shift if we're going to spend the next hour or so discussing it, because this is a discussion. We're all going to say a few words, and then we'd really like to hear from you, and we'd like to engage you in this discussion. A paradigm is a belief or a set of beliefs shared consistently across a group of individuals. And a paradigm shift is a change, a consistent change in those beliefs. Now, in science, in engineering, and technology, one paradigm can often completely replace another paradigm. It wouldn't make any sense, for example, for a physicist today to still use the paradigm of ether in talking about how light propagates through space. That is an old paradigm that has been abandoned through a paradigm shift. We should also remember that part of what we're going to be talking about this afternoon are political, social, and business paradigm shifts. And it is possible for multiple paradigms to coexist comfortably in those domains. So that said, I think something that should be important to everybody in this room, and something that is incumbent on us to ask, how can we shift the paradigm around space towards some of the constructs that we're talking about at the NewSpace conference? And the fast answer from where I sit is, don't try. Don't try to shift a paradigm.
Well,
Don't do it. What in the hell do I mean by that? Paradigm shift is not a lever you can pull. Everything in my experience at IDEO, looking at the innovation field, tells me that paradigm shift is not an independent variable that you can drive towards. Paradigm shift is not something where you engage in social media, for example, with the explicit goal of paradigm shift. Rather, I submit that paradigm shift is a healthy and entirely unpredictable consequence of propelling innovation forward. And particularly, paradigm shifts are consequences of propelling forward technology and scientifically enabled innovation in some domain. Okay? Let's look at one historical example, and then let's talk about two current examples where I think paradigms are shifting today as examples of that. When Cisco was a young-ish company, and I had teams at IDEO working with Cisco, and then later on, when Netflix was a new company, and we had people working with Netflix, you know, nobody said, hey, at Cisco, our goal is to shift the paradigm from bandwidth scarcity to bandwidth abundance. Now, I argue that that's exactly what happened. Some of you in the room, I'm one, remember when TV sets had rabbit ears on top and you had 13 channels and you had about 7 detented clicks that you could go into to figure out what channel you wanted to watch, okay? That was a paradigm that none of us ever questioned of bandwidth, wireless bandwidth scarcity, okay? Through driving server and router technology forward at Cisco, and through continuing around business applications to drive that technology forward at Netflix, the world now has a paradigm through streaming audio and streaming video, I think we'd all agree, of bandwidth abundance. And there are companies, you know, all around us here in the Valley that are benefiting hugely from that bandwidth abundance. But again, keep in mind that nobody I worked with at places like Netflix or any number of other firms that were availing themselves of those emerging technologies ever said, we are shifting from bandwidth scarcity to bandwidth abundance. That was a consequence that seemed that seemed obvious in retrospect, but as Ivan pointed out, we just sort of accepted bandwidth scarcity as an obvious fact, okay? What's exciting currently that we might think about as sort of a precedent for some of the paradigm shifts that we all hope for in NewSpace? Synthetic biology is certainly an enabling technology which I point to as a candidate to shift paradigms significantly. We just sort of accepted for many years that creation of ethanol required biomass. And whether that biomass came from subsidized corn, whether it came from switchgrass, whether it came from plankton from the sea, we just sort of accepted biomass as this necessary enabler of ethanol. It is now entirely possible that with water, sunlight, and a small amount of feedstock, or even possibly just water, air, and sunlight, that genetically engineered organisms will excrete ethanol without distillation even being required. That's a pretty fundamental paradigm shift in the way that people think about ethanol and other fuels. And of course, we could point to all sorts of other interesting paradigm shifts that are likely to be enabled by synthetic biology, such as recent demonstrations both in France and at UC Berkeley for the creation of malaria drugs at costs that are potentially at scale much lower than traditional pharma processes from genetically engineered organisms. Another quick example I would give, which you should have a look at if you haven't already, is Makani Power, which is a recent acquisition of Google X. I and almost everybody else I know, when we talked about wind power, we do a lot of work with alternative energy currently at IDEO. We just accepted a 100-ton device, a wind turbine, made by people like GE and Mitsubishi, as a necessary enabler. And it never occurred to us that through incredibly sophisticated control technology, you could get rid of 99% of the mass, which is literally what Makani Power is doing, and create what they target to be about 600 watts per wind turbine by having a tether-mounted airplane wing that spins in a huge circle analogous to the tip of the rotor of a current turbine where the airspeed is greatest. So there again, I would say that you're talking about, what we're talking about here is a team of people who had a specific technology vision around alternative energy, driving technology forward, creating new business models, exploring new regulatory models, and in the process, as a necessary and healthy consequence, shifting the mental constructs, shifting the beliefs and the paradigms that many of us, that many of us accept. The two last points I would make is, first that I feel sure that regardless of how it is we shift our paradigms in NewSpace, that exponentially advancing technologies, the sort of things you see studied at Singularity University, artificial intelligence, synthetic biology, advances in robotics, and so on will be essential. And I also just want to say that in order to propel these forward, somehow, somewhere, continuing to assert the profile of STEM education in the United States and all over the world is a terribly important enabler.
Great. Thanks, Dave. I would, excuse me? Oh, sorry. I thought you were saying your name wasn't Dave. It's Dave. I got it. Okay, good. So you and I would have an interesting conversation about that, because I firmly believe that paradigm shifts can be caused. That's my business in some way. But there's no question that new innovations do cause people to think. But I think if I dug out what you were saying, one lesson learned, I think, from us, and it's probably a thing we hear a lot but probably don't pay much attention to, is question your assumptions. And I think we almost never, certainly in business, I rarely see people say, okay, what's the assumptions behind this plan? Particularly the ones that we think are obvious. And the ones we think are absolutely true and there's no question about it. Because those are the ones that I think are really holding back the innovation. And I would say the people that produced the innovation probably did have a paradigm shift. Now the rest of us caught up when, it's like the 4-minute mile. When you see it, oh, okay, good, then but Roger Bannister had to have the paradigm shift before we did.
I agree, and I just wanted to share my poster child for questioning assumptions, Musk.
Yes.
Elon Musk.
Yeah, very good. Okay, next, one of the areas that is currently in the midst of trying to create a paradigm shift is unmanned UAVs. Now, they're pretty common in the defense area, so obviously there's some political argument about it. But now the whole issue is why there's some phenomenal possibilities for UAVs. There's also lots of public concern about them. Does that mean I've lost the use of my backyard now? My neighbor bought a $700 UAV that's peering over the hedge all the time. And I'm not sure I'm okay with that, and yet there's tremendous commercial possibilities. So there's clearly some public paradigms that need to be dealt with this area. And Larry, you're right in the middle of this.
Okay. Well, I'm going to throw away these notes because I want to take kind of the path that we started down here to talk about paradigms in the industry, and I'll talk about paradigms primarily in unmanned aerial systems, or UAVs or drones, and begin going back to the 1880s when hot air balloons were probably the first unmanned air systems that were used as weapons in the Franco-Prussian War. And since that time, they've been primarily the domain of national security or various militaries. And this capability has grown in capability and sophistication over the years, from the times go back to Vietnam when we had some reconnaissance drones, of which not all of them were ever recovered. They didn't all work. They were problematic at best in how valuable they were. We had unmanned helicopters for anti-submarine operations that sometimes just flew over the horizon, never to be seen again, a program called DASH many, many years ago. And had grown into the sophistication of systems like Global Hawk, above 60,000 feet, doing high altitude, long endurance surveillance, or Predator, which was enabled an unmanned air system to actually do precision attack in places where you maybe didn't want to send manned aircraft. So it's been the domain of national security, and in the process has not given itself a great name. So when you think about the word drone, we do conjure up images of small UAVs peering over your backyard or in your windows in your house, and so there's a paradigm to be overcome in terms of privacy. But the shift is definitely now coming from national security to the commercial arena, and what's forcing that are not only the technology changes, but also the compelling economics of it. And I can give a couple examples that are so easy. You know, they're what you might call no-brainers. Think about what the city of Los Angeles might spend in manned helicopters for their police force to maintain the aircraft, the pilot qualifications, on, and then compare that what they can do with an unmanned system that can stay airborne longer. You don't have to feed and pay the crew, and you can get the same benefit from it. Even better, they're less obtrusive, make less noise. You can observe things better than you could with a manned helicopter. Think about being a farmer being able to survey his field. It's now possible through the technology that he can get up in the morning and have a little handheld aircraft that he throws into the air. It surveys his crops in maybe half an hour. It's done. It lands. In the interim, the data has been transferred to some big data facility where a hyperspectral image is analyzed, and he figures out where he needs to precisely add a little more fertilizer or less fertilizer, or more water or less water, or more pesticide or less pesticide, and that's what precision agriculture is all about. So these industries are tremendously beneficial, but they are coming with some difficult paradigm shifts. And right now, the current paradigm shifts involve airspace integration and privacy. I guess I'll talk about privacy first. Nearly every state in the union, I think, you know, almost 47 or 48 states, have had legislation introduced in their state legislatures that would do things like ban the ownership of unmanned air vehicles by anybody, or require everybody to register them, or to specify the things that they can do, and only these things can they do. And so there's an issue about privacy that has to be overcome. Fortunately, there are some very competent groups working these issues with common sense legislation that even the ACLU is agreeable to, that can protect our privacy. And there's also the idea of being able to enforce the laws that we have now to keep these things from becoming a nuisance or intruding on our privacy. So there's answers there to overcome that issue. The airspace integration is a much tougher thing. I'll back up a little bit, and I'll talk a little bit about, if anybody remembers way back, as model airplanes and radio control airplanes, if you remember those, and you're probably a little brain damaged because you smelled the glue and the shellac that you put on the paper and everything as you built them. And then you had to have a very expensive radio, or if you didn't have a lot of money like I did when I was growing up, I think I had a single channel, rudder only, and kind of free flight, launched that powered thing and just let it go and did the best I could. And so that was a hobbyist, and they sort of regulated themselves, and they developed policies that were endorsed by the FAA. You know, things like, you know, we don't fly in the vicinity of airports. We do some processes to ensure that we don't intrude on each other's frequencies as we're flying. So they had radios with different frequencies and flags with different colors at the field where you flew, and you always did things that were within your line of sight so that things were controlled and safe, and they were separated from commercial aviation. Well, now there is a compelling need to take our unmanned systems because of their commercial value and mix them with the what we call controlled airspace, or the national airspace system. And this creates difficulties because there are some natural tensions. The FAA is a regulatory agency over this, and nobody at the FAA gets paid to say yes, right? And nobody at the FAA gets paid to take any risk. And so it's going to be a difficult process. And there are some technology things that have to be completed, and some processes that have to be sorted out, and some ways to certify pilots and airframes and control systems to ensure that this integration can be done safely. But to give you an idea of the kind of problems that we have with this, the FAA now wants to regulate airspace that they have never controlled in the past. And if you're a radio control hobbyist, and you maybe attach a camera to your little airplane, you fly around, and you take some video by taping your cell phone to your airplane, and you enjoy these things and you post them online, and you're having fun with those videos, that's one thing. You can do the same thing with the same video, and if you sell it to somebody, you now run afoul of the FAA. And so the FAA is going to have to take a step back and probably institute some common sense policies that will accommodate the technology that's available now and allow that for commercial practices. And the most obvious case is for the film industry, probably. You know, to allow them to have the same operating policies that we allow our hobbyists, I think it would be a common sense forward that the FAA can do very quickly without a lot of think tank type activity going into that. So those are the first paradigms that have to be overcome. And as Ivan said, we're in the midst of these paradigm changes. And so, you know, what's coming next, of course, is driverless cars. You know, and I have to ask everybody the question is, why do we accept 30,000 plus highway deaths every year? When, you know, if we had autonomous cars, we probably would not kill that many people on the highway. Of course, this is a very expensive thing. This is a high technology thing. It'll take a long time to come. And people will resist giving up the freedom to be able to drive their own cars. But I, for one, would much rather do that than sit in traffic. I'd rather read the paper, talk on the phone, do other activities while I'm on my way to work. So that's going to be a big paradigm shift. Another big paradigm shift will be taking the technology that we have now and moving cargo through the air. It won't be Amazon probably, because I think they have a lot of challenges in trying to get an economic model that makes sense for delivering packages in to your condo, to your apartment with an unmanned air system. But I think that carriers like FedEx and UPS are soon going to be flying pilotless aircraft and moving cargo that way. And I unfortunately don't think it'll be happening in the United States first. It'll happen where there are less regulatory burdens, probably in Africa and in Asia and Europe. And unfortunately, just like precision agriculture, because of the overreach of our government agencies and our bureaucracy, it'll happen last here in the United States. And then we get to the next big paradigm shift. And to do this, I'll use my favorite analogy, and that is, I don't know how many in the room here are old enough to remember elevator operators. But you used to get into an elevator with an operator, and they had a break. Had a little seat they sat on. It was typically a woman in a department store, is the way I remember it growing up. And she had a brake, and you'd go to the floor and manually brake this elevator, and sometimes you had to adjust up and down, and then the doors would open and people would get on and off the elevator. And then a magic thing happened, and we got buttons to be able to automatically push a button and go to the floor that you wanted to go to. And guess what? The elevator operators were still there for a while, because I know that people were uncomfortable about being in an elevator unaccompanied by an operator, right? And so eventually the operators went away, and if you go to a very modern office building, I first saw this in London, you have a bank of elevators with a kiosk. You make your request at the kiosk, and then it directs you to a certain elevator, and when you get in that elevator, there are no buttons. And it has a screen, it tells you what floor you're going to go to, but there are no buttons in the elevator. So even that can be a little disconcerting. So imagine getting in in your passenger airline and having no pilot. And I can say this as a pilot myself, that it's going to be a lot safer. And we will realize a lot of benefits from this. We'll get where we're going faster, and we'll get there safer. Because a little bit of automation is a dangerous thing, as we learned with the Asiana accident here in San Francisco. So I think those are the paradigms that we're facing in unmanned systems, and I've been told by a FedEx friend of mine that where they're going at FedEx is that when they're unmanned, they're only going to have one person on the jet, and they'll have one person and a dog, and the person will monitor what's going on, and then if the person attempts to intervene with what's going on, the dog will bite him. So that's where we are, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
So great, Larry. So let me see if I can summarize lessons learned a little bit from what you said. If you're going to have a paradigm shift, one is there needs to be a big need, either already there or that you create in the hearts and the minds. So one, people aren't going to shift unless there's something in it for them. And the second thing I heard is find out where the horse, in my lingo, is find out which direction the horse is already riding in. Like, don't go for the backyards first, go for the film industry or go for the agriculture. Get it, rather than trying to do everything all at once, go for the, where's the easy wins that you can demonstrate.
I think the low-hanging fruit is what we call it.
That's a technical term for it.
Exactly.
Right. And I think the other one is that government can be a big problem.
They can be an enabler, but they can also be quite an obstacle as well.
Yeah. So I'm not even going to try and take on how you do paradigm shifts inside the Beltway. That may truly be impossible. We shall see. So, Jordy, you've been there at the beginning of this thing. I mean, clearly when you started, satellites and spacecraft were big, huge, complex, multi-million-dollar deals that only NASA or government or so of those could really afford. And so you were there before anybody even imagined something this small, and you've seen the development of it. So now they're being launched off the ISS, which, I mean, you know how conservative to let anything on the ISS, and yet you're also in the middle of that because new stuff is happening. So tell us a little bit about how that came about. How did that, some of the obstacles you ran into, the give me a break, Jordy, that'll never work kind of stuff you dealt with, and how you shifted that.
No, thank you, and this has been really good because I mean I'm in the same boat. I have some notes, but you guys said so many things that I should be writing. And you're right, we were there at the beginning, but I think we saw what somebody else said about that you don't try to do the paradigm shift. Is the law of unintended consequences. You were trying to do something completely different. And I was an academic. I am an academic. We were trying to solve an academic problem. We were trying to get students to fly spacecraft. So that academic objective freed us from the need to do things. All we had to do is train students. And what happened is that we could train the students. We could put a Sputnik app, and that was good enough. So when people said, these things are idiotic, you cannot do anything useful with them, that was true of JPL, and that was true to Boeing, but I can do something useful. I can teach a student to integrate and test something that has to go to space. And that's all I cared about. So we were not trying to do what it turns out we did, which is really what everybody's been talking about, is the idea that you're trying to solve a problem and all of a sudden something else gets solved as well. And over lunch we were hearing about this lunar lander that is actually a great tug to go deploy things in orbit. So it has this additional shift. So that's the first thing that I think we did, is we were trying to solve problem A, which we did solve, and in the process we created a new industry. And that was nothing that we were trying to do.
I hate to interrupt you. That reminds you, I can't remember who our first speaker was this morning,
Yeah.
but he said that the real brilliance is when an entrepreneur like Elon Musk is trying to solve, how do I land on Mars? But in that process, he solves a problem that make him money on the way to that, like a reusable booster.
And we are actually in a different paradigm when it comes to that, in that we didn't have an ultimate great objective. We actually had a very simple, humble objective to teach students that actually had a big impact. So it's another way of getting to those big shifts, that it's not trying to get somewhere high, you're trying to go somewhere low, so you're trying something. And once you try it and you realize, oh crap, this works, now you can do other things. The one thing that I find interesting is that we were not the first ones to do small space. And I think there's somebody from Surrey here, and they should get the credit. The AMSAT community in Surrey, we're doing that. We're saying, we don't have the money, we're gonna go buy some electronics, you know, and a solid spinner for the antenna, and we're gonna go fly that as an AMSAT satellite. The thing that I think we changed is we created a standard because we knew that students had a hard time wrapping themselves about a very open problem. So we said, we'll give you a box, put something inside. So that helped them. And then the other thing we did is we made it really small to facilitate the launches. So what we ended up coming up with is a way for the primary payloads to not be too worried, because we were this little thing. I mean, how much damage can you do? And then it was standardized, so there was a lot of people doing it. So the demand for launch capacity and the ease on going into the launcher meant that all of a sudden the launch availability became open. And that was the shift. The idea that I can launch now. And we saw scientists go from, I need this exquisite instrument that weighs 10 kilos, but I'm never gonna fly it, or it's gonna take me 10 years. Or I can make this simpler instrument that's not as good, but man, these guys are really getting up. So in 2 years, I could have it in space. So that's what really happened. And the only way to do that was to get away from traditional aerospace components, materials, and processes. So one of the unintended consequences is we used commercial off-the-shelf technology and moved our type of spacecraft, moved away from the big space ecosystem. We entered the commercial electronics world, and that was a completely new way of looking at the world. You know, Steve was talking this morning about, 10 years is 1,000 times better. We all of a sudden jumped on that lane of the freeway, and it was moving really fast. And there were people investing billions of dollars to make my life easier, which was kind of nice. So that's the first thing that happened. We got away from the food chain of the dinosaurs, and we were, out on the bush with a bunch of other people that were doing things. The other thing that happens is you get into this low-cost, high-risk tolerance mode. So it's very low cost, so anybody can do it. And since it's cheap, you can fail and you don't break the bank. So you start trying things instead of getting into this analysis paralysis mode that the aerospace industry, when you're building a billion-dollar system, you better analyze everything and know this is the answer. And you spend a tremendous amount of time trading between solutions. And I teach a design class where we design big spacecraft. And in that class, the problem is always like, there is these 2 or 3 ways to go, and man, they all look really good, but at some point we have to choose one. And that, I feel, is one of the issues with big space sometimes, is you're gonna build one Mars rover. So you're gonna get one shot. So you spend a lot of time picking, and you never know that you picked the right one. And what's happening with CubeSats now is it's so low cost, and it's so easy to get in, that we're trying lots of things. And people will try and fail. And they'll have that mindset. I'm gonna try this, if it doesn't work, I'll go to plan B. And I think we're getting Darwinian in the approach. We're trying everything. And there's some things that work and some things that don't. But the speed of change is exponential now. And going back to the Surrey issue, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for those guys. The one difference is there was one of them. And they were absolute visionaries. But they were one of them, they could try one thing at a time. What we see now is we have, I always tell people, and I've been saying this for many years now, that once we got to 100 developers of CubeSats, I stopped counting because I couldn't keep up. But there's hundreds of people doing it. So now it's that same innovative spirit exponentially multiplied by bunches of brains all over the world with all kinds of different problems. That's the other thing that's very interesting to see. The CubeSat developers in Africa have a completely different mindset about what they're trying to accomplish from CubeSat developers in Europe and the US. And I think the local problem solvers will find the missions that fit their domain, and it will be a local guy that will come up with it. They'll say, this is something I can do. The same way that telephone banking, you know, making your bank minutes on your phone was not discovered here, because we have banks, but in places where they don't, they come up with these different solutions. So I think we're gonna see some of that. The other thing that I wanna put up that is very interesting, and I wrote it down when I was listening to you guys, is that a lot of the history you guys were presenting, the computers, for example, it was technology shifts that we were seeing. You go to the transistor and you go to the microprocessor and you have these different things that make these improvements. The thing that I find fascinating with CubeSat is we didn't do any technology development. I mean, we made a very sophisticated jack-in-the-box. That was the Peapod, and it was important, but it was not a breakthrough. And none of the satellites have really broken something where it's like, oh my God, there's this new solar cell all of a sudden, you know, or this new optic system. All we've done is change the mindset on the items we're willing to use, the risk we're willing to take, and then all the technology was available. There was this plethora of technology that aerospace was not using because it's unproven, it's scary, we don't want to go there. And I think that's a very interesting thing, that the change was not technological, it was mindset, and now we've gone from this experiment that the university started to try to see if this was feasible, to business, which is the next step. And I think that's blown me away, that the way in which the entrepreneur class has said, wow, this is like cell phones. This is like all these other things I understand, so I'm going to jump in. And before, space was like, I don't understand it, it's really scary, very expensive, that the returns on investment, we're not going to do that. And that's the step where we're in. That's the paradigm shift we're seeing now, is these people are using that experiment that succeeded at the university level and running with it on the business side.
That's so in terms of the purpose of the panel, what I hear you saying, which is sort of what we're working on, but I phrase it a little differently, to get the public involved, which is, you know, look, we don't have to get anybody in this room committed to space. I mean, you know, there's all the choir here in the room, right? It's the people that aren't here, and that's most of the world. So if I was going to extract a lesson learned, it's this, to make it available to, you know, the public has got to see itself as a participant in the game. And right now they don't. They see this is the, you know, astronauts having a great time, scientists doing their thing, and engineers just doing their thing. But I'm sitting there, there's nobody landing on the moon that I can take pride of. There's the shuttles, when the shuttle traveled through the streets of LA, everybody was really proud of what we've accomplished, but there's no experience of that. But you're saying with the with the ability to do these low cost, if you're willing to take the high risk, which is exactly the opposite of what we've been doing, and take high risk, but make it really inexpensive so the public can start experiencing this and have them feel part of access to space. Maybe it's a little simple thing, but
and we've seen that at the university level.
yeah.
What we've seen at the university level is the students would go into a program that allowed them to build a spacecraft. They got to touch it. They got to do it. And what we're seeing is a lot of those students reject the traditional aerospace industry. When they go out and they look for a job, they look the way that big aerospace does business, and they say, this is not what I'm doing.
Right.
I don't want to go backwards. So that's where we see all these little startups. It's a bunch of them. It's just the students that know there is another way because they experience it in school, and they're taking that to the commercial.
Particularly critical with the millennials. With that generation is, I want to do something that has meaning today, not 10,000 hours, not 10,000 years on. Larry, is there something you were?
Yeah, you said something that was very interesting when you talked about using existing technology in a different way, that new technology really wasn't developed. And it brings to mind me, I didn't mention it, I should have, is probably one of the biggest technology accelerators to UAVs was GPS. And if we go back and look at the history, it seems to me that GPS was developed as missile control, from submarines to find a way to get missiles to a target. And then we figured out there were all kinds of commercial purposes for that, like, in your car and driving someplace. And then it got small enough that it got into UAVs. And once it got into UAVs, and then you coupled it with good software, now you don't need to go out and practice how you're going to fly your model airplane. You can just, you don't have to do anything but say, go to this point, hover, and then go over to this point and hover, and come back to me and land. And so it's completely changed the game, but it wasn't necessarily new technology. It was just a different application of old technology that was packaged better, that was more available because it was less expensive, and then it was tailored for that purpose.
Now, it's a little bit like what John said. It was seeing the symbiosis of two very different things and putting them together to serve a need. We've been having a ball up here, but I guess it's time to let you guys in on the conversation. So we're really open to anything any question, suggestion, comment, how would you might you, and looks like we're starting to line up already. That's great. So let's start over here.
Hi, Eric Dahlstrom. What my question is about bad actors and the paradigm shift as applies to them. All these powerful technologies getting cheaper. It's providing incredible opportunities in space and UAVs and SynBio and everything else. But also besides enabling individuals and entrepreneurs, it also enables potential threats. And one thing I was thinking back to with this, factor of 1 billion increase in computing power, that it used to be that computers were, some level of computers were restricted from export for being dangerous. And now, as soon as you turn on an iPhone, you click through the agreement, and buried in the agreement says that you're not allowed to use it to design a nuclear weapon.
Shucks.
And if you do, then the Apple lawyers will come after you, and that's scary. And so I just wonder what you thought about these transformations and what it means for the future society when good guys are enabled and bad guys are enabled too.
Somebody want to take that one on? Dave?
I think you raise an extremely important point, and I think paradigm shifts in crime and from bad actors will be an issue that it's already becoming increasingly important. I think if others in the room are interested in this issue and want to inform themselves on it, there is a writer named Mark Goodman who runs a group called the Future Crimes Institute. He is a technologist, and what he talks about he studies how everything from theft of DNA to mobile devices used to enable essentially enhanced terrorism will continue to be an issue. I think you raise a good point, and all I want to say there is we see issues again and again where the public sector, whether we're talking about law enforcement or regulatory agencies such as the FDA and the FAA, are not set up in a sufficiently agile way to keep pace with the advance of technology. And if there's anything that points to an imperative about figuring out innovative ways to speed up the course of regulation and the course of public sector activities, it's the imperative for law enforcement to keep up and to stay on top of rapid advance in technology.
Sort of like the virus detector folks keeping on top of things.
Yeah, I think just for perspective, when people first built roads, you had highwaymen that exploited those to rob people, right? And when we built bridges, you had whoever had power was there to collect a toll. Or when you built rivers and canals and commercial traffic moved there, and of course it's gone on to the cyber attacks and identity theft and things like that. I think you're right. I think it comes regardless of where the technology goes, and we just have to find agile ways to combat the nefarious activity.
I think it's a good one. What it does is, for those of us who are studying, okay, what is this paradigm shift? What it says is we better consider the bad uses too. It was one of the things I wanted to follow up from what you said, Jordy, is that in terms of getting, one of the things we can do to get the public more aware, feeling more a part of it, is communicate it that way. For example, Virgin Galactic, people emphasize that it costs $200,000 and it's not available to most people. I look at it, okay, yeah, the first ones are going to be for the rich folks, but you know darn well that price is going to come down, and I dream, to me it says, okay, it's there, and good, the more rich folks that buy it, the cheaper it's going to get for the rest of us, and someday my kids will be able to afford it, maybe my grandkids. But to me, it's just like when Dennis Tito went up, and NASA said, well, you can't have a tourist up here. What about, you can't have tourists with explorers. That doesn't make any sense. Instead of saying, hey, space is going to be available for everybody, and Dennis is just the first one. That's, I think, how we communicate. Okay, over there.
Ever since we had the excitement of Apollo, we sent astronauts on a very dangerous mission to a big rock very far away. And it was really, really exciting. And I think there's been a paradigm amongst much of the space movement that what we really need, and if we don't have it, we're going in the wrong direction, is that excitement. So we want to send a really dangerous mission a long ways away to Mars, and then the astronauts get down, will be so exciting. But I really think, and I see a little bit of this happening, the comment, that the real goal is settlement and economic expansion. And you don't want excitement, okay? If you're going back and forth to settlements, you don't want a 1% chance of blowing up. That doesn't work. And you don't want to go far away. You want to stay as close as conceivably possible, maybe even just LEO. Right? And I think in a lot of cases, there's people who sort of say, oh, yes, and settlement, but what they really want is that excitement. And I think that this is a paradigm shift that is really, really important to us and that is in part of us. And I don't know, maybe you guys agree, maybe you think I'm full of nonsense, but I'd like to hear your opinion.
I would give you a different word. And it occurred to me when Ivan was summing up what I said earlier about what we needed is to recapture the sense of danger, something that might go wrong. And the only thing I would add to that is I'm not so sure it's danger, and I'm not even sure it's excitement. When I think about what made me excited about space, it was a sense of wonder. And I think a sense of wonder is different from a sense of excitement. I don't think there's something about space to capture the popular attention that has to keep us on the edge of our seats all the time. I think it's just the sense that there's something bigger out there, and it's always going to be out there. And the more we extend our ability to reach out and be in touch with whatever that is that's out there, kind of rekindles a sense of wonder that I think can always be there a bit, rather than a sense of excitement. I'm not a big fan of films that only glorify the sense of absolute disaster, like Gravity, which are fun. That was an amazing film, but I think the thing that keeps us hooked into what's happening in space is something different other than just the constant adrenaline rush. And I really would love for us to find a way to recapture that, just speaking as a civilian.
John, I think that I stand corrected, and I think you're right on. My comment is NASA is the only federal agency that doesn't have to exist. You know, it's completely discretionary. We got to have an army. We got to have a justice system. We really have to have an education. We really have to have a health system. Whether the feds are providing it, or the state, or philanthropic organizations, we need that stuff. We don't need NASA. You know, there's no. But why does it exist then? And I think it exists for exactly what you said. It's because we have, as humans, this natural desire to explore, to see beyond, to what's around the next ridge, and to be wondered at it, you know, even wondered at a sunset. I think you're right on that, and I stand corrected on the danger part. I think you're right on.
One thing that
Jordy?
I want to point out is business don't want excitement. Elon Musk doesn't want the Falcon launches to be exciting. They want them to be really boring. And actually, one of the things that I find interesting, Elon has captured the imagination without the danger. You know, it's not like Virgin has people on it, you know, but what Elon is putting in front of people is, this is going to be less expensive, this is going to open it up. And that is the wondering without danger. I mean, nobody is there going, is the Falcon 9 going to blow or not?
No,
They just want him to succeed because it's changing the way.
I think you're right, but I think the real calculus is risk and return. You know, it's just like investing in the stock market. If you can have more return if you're willing to accept more risk. And so I think there is a certain level of risk that we're willing to accept to be able to satisfy this desire for, you know, the wonder of what's out there and what we can discover.
I think Elon, though, it's not just that, because the way he says it is, as long as the human species is confined to the surface of one planet, it's in danger of extinction. And therefore, we're saving the human species. So, I mean, that's pretty cool. I mean, it's hard to get a business with a bigger vision than we're saving human species. You know, and there's Mars, and that's how we're going to save it. So I do think there's that excitement in, I mean, it's a biggie, but, you know, it's like that. Okay, we, over there, we have
I also think, going along with what you're talking about, SpaceX, I mean, we want to see more in our lives. Most people here, we need at work to accomplish more with less. That's the opposite of what NASA's done over the last 50 years. Mm-hmm. We want to see things improve, not just go along and not change. We want to see things get better. Elon Musk wants to give us a whole new planet with as big a landmass as on Earth, as all of the continents on Earth. And this is a start only with the rest of the solar system. I mean, the excitement is our potential of improving our life and our descendants' life, and helping solve problems here. And that's what he's opening up. That's what he's trying to give us, is this Mars and the solar system. That's what's exciting.
And very good. And that's what we got to get the people that aren't in this room to say it, and as enthusiastically as you did. Is there any comments? No, I think the thing, though, that there's two things I would say based on what I've heard so far. One is, you know, whatever that excitement was, we've got to include the people that aren't in this room. Not just be excited ourselves, but how do we have them see themselves in that? And the other thing is, despite what I said already, we got to stop making NASA wrong. We're not going to get there without them. I mean, they're a partner in it. Yes, we can say, yeah, you know, it would be better if you did it this way, but you know what? They got us to where we are today, and we're standing on the shoulders of what they accomplished. So I know whatever we do from here on out, it'd be useful to have them as partners. And that doesn't mean we should stop saying, you know, you really should think about this. That would help us all get where we want to be. Let's see, you're next.
Yes. So I build hardware for space. And one thing that bothers me a lot is I have to build it to survive in the environment here. I have to put heaters on things. I have to make things cooler. Why can't we switch their whole way of thinking? If we're going to some place where there's no heat, just make it out of components that don't require heat. Or if you're going someplace where it's really hot, make it out of components that can survive the heat. I don't understand why we have to always think about making the circuit survive on something like this.
Well said. Anybody want to make a comment on that? But I mean, I think what you've heard is a question, that was a great example of questioning our assumptions.
I think it's interesting because, let me just answer the question. It's actually amazing the range that the electronics will survive. And we can, at some point things melt and you have to stay within the range. The one thing that is very interesting is that if you look at industrial electronic, they work under the hood of your car. Where it's cold in the winter and hot in the summer, and it's hot when the engine's on, and there's vibration and noise and all kinds of things. The thing that I think that the space industry has done that takes that vision of these guys are just making it too hard is that I need it to last for 15 years without touching it, which is really important for some systems. But if you want to do everything like that, then you're in that mode where you have to go find these exquisite components that are very expensive. And I think some of what we've done is not necessarily not deal with thermal control, but try to find components that don't have to be the exquisite component that lasts 15 years.
Yeah, keep it low cost. Let's see, over there? Yes.
Okay, I said this in some other form yesterday, Esther Dyson, but to go back to the previous question of how do we get people outside this room excited?
Yes.
STEM is exciting, and yes, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, I think you'd excite people also by opening it up. There are jobs around the space industry that are not techie jobs. They need bookkeepers. They need people sweeping up the buildings. They're going to need chefs in space someday. They need designers. They certainly need business people. So in many ways, the space message is, well, if you're not a space geek, this really isn't relevant to you. So to make it relevant and also economically interesting, I think would help a lot. That was a question, of course.
I'm sorry, say your question again, please.
Yeah.
Just the question. Huh? Oh, it was a comment. Oh, I thought it was a question.
It's a very good comment, and thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Just to give you an example, my children are both autistic, and we tend to look at people with autism through the label disabled, and that's a label that says what's wrong with them. And it turns out that people on the autism spectrum have some tremendous talents in the area of doing objective, detailed, repetitive work. And so I went to my aerospace and defense clients and said, could you use anybody that really is good at repetitive, boring, objective work? And they said, oh yeah, we got all this paperwork that needs to be scanned, and we got all this stuff in quality that needs to be, we can't find anybody to do it because it's boring and terrible. I said, so at the end result is that Hollar Aerospace has 6 people working for him that otherwise would be on welfare. And I think that follows, well, that's a little bit, yeah, thank you. I think so I've coined the word uniquely abled, and I think that following off of what Esther says, that really it's an inclusive. So I get that the hook is close, I got 1 minute. So I really, I think that just first of all, thank you to a phenomenal panel. I really, really appreciate that. And I think the thing, if I was gonna leave us with one message, it's inclusiveness. If we're gonna stop being a movement and become the future, not just NewSpace, but the way space is, we've got to include a lot more people than in this room. And so I would say as an action, whoever you're going to see who wasn't here at the conference, your spouse or your children or your friends, figure out a way to include them in what you're excited about. Thank you very much. You've been great.